Good afternoon and welcome everyone. We are delighted that you're able to join us today to deep dive in the topic of data sourcing. For those of you who were able to join us this morning, you heard about data use case identification and namely the ways your organization can define its target beneficiaries and measure the impact of or value of its service, all with the objective of addressing some of the world's biggest challenges. As you know, at Bloomberg and J.P. Morgan, we strongly believe in the power of data, and for us, there is really a role to play, not only for businesses but also for nonprofit organizations to ultimately achieve even higher impact goals. Today, this afternoon, we will start on our digital data journey by hearing from Rio, who is data analyst on the funds and data science team at Bloomberg, and Nikolai Sachsmeyer, who is J.P. Morgan's data management director. And they will tell us more about data sourcing and how critical it is to rely on consistent and accessible data sources that meet your organization's needs throughout its life cycle. Along the presentation, please do send any questions you may have in the Q&A box in the chat box, and we will use some time at the end of the session to take as many questions as possible. That being said, I will now hand it over to Rio and Nikolai to take you on this journey.
Thanks, Marie. Hi, everyone. My name's Rio, and I work in the Global Data Department here at Bloomberg in London. So can we move to the next slide, please? So in this presentation, just to give you a quick rundown, we're going to begin by going over some key considerations. So understanding why you're collecting data in the first place and how your objectives, so what you're trying to help solve for, really shape how you go about selecting, acquiring, and integrating that data. We're going to discuss the importance of understanding your data from both an ROI perspective, looking at the difference between commercially and non-commercially sourced data, and from a risk and compliance perspective, briefly touching on personal data and GDPR. And we're also going to consider some of the challenges and the best practices when it comes to integrating data and go over some of the resources that can help you along the way. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nikolai.
Thanks, Rio. Marie, can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. We wanted to frame the whole topic of data collection or data sourcing first, right? And give us a little bit of context. There are plenty of reasons why you would want to engage in data collection, right? Enable analysis, drive optimization, generate ideas, map relationships, many more. The key point that we want to get at is really that ultimately what you're looking to achieve should inform what you're going to source, or what you're looking to source, and how you're going to go about this. We're not going to go into an awful lot of detail on specific types of analyses, and output generation methods in this session. There are other sessions, as part of the Data for Good program this week that cover that specifically. What we want to talk about here is really go into the detail of understanding, how you effectively and appropriately select your source data, bring it into your organization, and use it for the purpose you're looking to do. So the first question really you're gonna ask yourself, on this journey is, what do you actually want to achieve, right? Start off the question, this question, because in the end, data collection should never be an end in itself, right? It has to be a means to an end. If you don't have that in mind, it's very easy to get carried away, without a clear vision. So do yourself a favor, and before you sit down saying, "Oh, I need to collect data," have more than the inkling that data is useful in mind. There needs to be a purpose to this, otherwise you're gonna get yourself tied up in knots. There's no need to get overly technical about this, right? But looking at the what, the why, and the how in broad terms up front will give you a point of reference to start designing your own data sourcing project. And that kind of takes us to the next point, which is really the question of defining your objectives, right? Once you've defined your high-level objectives for the collection itself, that'll make your undertaking your collection exercise much, much less challenging. right? It might sound like a truism, but unless you know what you're looking for, you're unlikely to find it. One thing to bear in mind, though, in this particular context is like exploration can be an objective in its own right. So don't be scared to stipulate that you want to find out something that you don't know about it before, rather than look for a very specific, detailed project-different outcome. And before we go further on this, the last critical point in this context I want to mention is really this: all data use is contextual, right? And what we mean by that is, say, data is not neutral in itself. Sometimes it can appear to be that it's driven by numbers. There's lots of things of it, and it's taken out of context, but it's not. It's not neutral, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach to like sourcing your data and using it. So again, make yourself aware of what you're looking to achieve and how you're going to go about getting that data that you need for this. Otherwise, again, you're just going to end up a little bit aimless, and that's not really where you want to be. I think this is where we move on to the next slide, please. So once you've once you understand the context of your data collection and its objectives, then you can start thinking about what the design considerations for your program would look like, right? And the first question you got to ask yourself there is really, well, what data are you looking to collect, right? There are many different things to collect, and not getting carried away with the university of possibilities here is key, right? Go back to basics, figure out what makes sense. Are you looking for call logs, customer feedback, metadata on customer feedback, performance stats, revenues? All of these things are valid, but as I will keep harping on about and already have to some extent, right? Begin with your goals in mind, right? And that informs what you're looking to collect. And that takes us right to the next step, which is about how you will collect your data, right? And I think before you get into questions about whether you should buy, collect, scrape, or otherwise, I think there's one thing to really stress, and that is to say it's okay to start small. Right? Sometimes a clipboard and a phone or spreadsheet and a small email survey is all you need. Right? Technical options don't necessarily need to be expensive or complicated. We have a little bit more to say on that later, and there are options out there. But ultimately, if you're starting from scratch, if you're new to the space, don't let yourself get overwhelmed with the fact that there's a highly educated and highly evolved industry out there that does this. In the end, this is about understanding your organization, your programs, your projects better by taking an approach that is not anecdotally driven, that is not based on gut feel and pure experience, from those that have been around the longest, but rather trying to find some points, that you can identify, count, observe, whatever you will, and use as an input in some kind of analytical framework. And that's, I'm going on from the question of saying that data collection for the sake of it is not particularly useful when it comes to questions of how are you actually going to use that. It's crucially important that selecting not just what you collect, but also figure out how you organize the collection of results. I guess the truism here is to say form follows function. What you're looking to what you're looking to output should really just be the driver of this collection choice in the first place. The last point really that it frames the design considerations is the question of what is the measure of success here, right? What are you actually looking to achieve? Just getting data, is not success in its own right. Defining the objectives will make the determination of success, or failure for that matter, much, much easier, right? And I guess the point to emphasize here is there are a plethora of different ways of measuring success, but you need to be conscious of that when you set out on this. This can be about just sourcing a certain number of records, survey a certain population or time horizon of activity, work on meet a measure of data quality that you've collected or obtained, or indeed functionally derived objectives that talks about enabling you to do something in particular that you set out to do. All of these are valid approaches, but the key message remains if you don't have consciousness of this, if you don't have a feel for, not a feel, but clear understanding of what you're looking to achieve, you can't work out how you get there. And that's really like the key message of the first section of the presentation we want to go through today. And I think this is now time to loosen it up. We've been told to be interactive, so we have a quiz for you. And I'm gonna let Rio administer this because I can't see it from this screen.
Yeah, can we get the poll, please? Okay, so this first question, quite simple, is just how long would it take to download all the content on the web? 181 days, 181 years, 181,000 years, and 181 million years. So if you could just fill that in with your answers. And we'll await the result. Okay, yeah, so it seems most people guessed the correct answer, which was 181 million years. And this question really is just there to outline the fact that there really is just a lot of data out there, far too much to source, to acquire, even if you wanted to, let alone cleaning the data or doing anything else with it. So can we move to the next slide, please? And can someone mute? Sorry, I hear something. Okay, so this slide, we're just going to briefly go over the difference between data types. So when it comes to sourcing your data, depending on your domain, you may actually encounter situations where the easiest, even the most cost-effective way to get the data that you need is just simply by paying someone else for it. So third-party data providers, which we're going to go through now, they offer data across a broad spectrum of different domains, different subjects. They offer things from bespoke data sets, things that they've built that you could find nowhere else, to quite commonly publicly available data, which is usually curated and labeled. And they'll also deliver it to you through potentially various delivery channels that you find convenient. And for many organizations and potentially many problems, a commercial data provider might be the answer that you're looking for. So typically you would have a contract with a third-party data provider that's up for negotiation, as well as SLAs for things such as data quality, timeliness, coverage, whatever it is that you care about in the data. And they, like I said, they offer many services such as integrating your data and allowing you to get the data the way that you want. For example, an Excel file delivered via email or SFTP access, or a web API on your favorite cloud platform. Now, having said all that, commercial data providers are simply one option for sourcing your data. And often one of the easiest ways to get started is to just look at the data that's out there in the public domain. So that is the freely available data. And one of the main sources of that would be, in this day and age, the internet. So a very large and growing actually subsection of publicly available data is what is termed open data. So open data is kind of a philosophy for compiling and sharing data, building data sets so that any individual or organization can use it in any way that they want. And these data sets that are made publicly available with no strings attached, we refer to them as open data sets. And one of the most attractive aspects about open data is the quality of the data. Well-maintained open data sets are often released by large organizations, universities, governments, and they're released in formats that are quite easy for a data analyst or a data scientist to work with relatively minimal pre-processing required. So there are thousands of data sets freely available online that we consider to be open data across a bunch of fields and domains. Some of the largest open repositories of data are the WHO's Global Health Observatory, the EU Open Data Portal. Within the world of finance, the World Bank has open data repositories, as does the IMF. And there are some really good websites out there that aggregate these data sets. We've included links at the end of this deck. Another option besides open data and commercial data providers is to source public data manually from the web. So in some cases, depending on the data that you want to capture, this might be the easiest way or the only way to collect certain types of data. And web source data is often a good starting point, a common starting point for exploratory data analysis and exploratory data collection and analysis, I guess. So when gathering data from the web, there are a lot of things that you must obviously keep in mind. You need to be mindful of copyright, for example. Also, some sources of data will include explicit restrictions on how the data can be used in the form of data licenses. And some of these licenses are more restrictive than others. So just because it's publicly facing doesn't mean it can just be used freely. And a good example of this is the Robin Track blog, which I don't know if any of you have heard of, but this is a blog which provided aggregated sentiment data for users of the Robinhood securities trading platform in the US. So this Robinhood got a lot of mainstream attention. If you remember the so-called meme stocks bubble involving GameStop from a couple of months ago. And while it was possible, so it's possible using this Robin Track blog to play with this data provided from Robinhood, the terms and conditions are quite restrictive. In fact, they're restrictive to the point where you can't really do much at all with it without violating the terms of the terms and conditions agreement. So this is also something to keep in mind with getting data from the web, is you need to know what you can do with it, especially as an organization, that you might have different rights to the data than an individual would have. And also not represented on this slide, but I think it's worth mentioning as well, is the option to simply create your own data sets. So this can be as simple as running online surveys or making phone calls and gathering information and organizing in Excel or whichever format you find more useful. Or you may wish to source the data internally. So this is something that will come up with again and again in the data for good. So for example, transaction data, personnel data, all of this internal data about your organization can be extremely useful to generate insights, particularly when it comes to operational analytics, which is an area covered in future sessions of this week. So that's that for that slide. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Yeah, so we're just going to move on to something related, which is personally identifiable information. So as I said before, when you're dealing with sourcing data, especially from the web, you need to be at least cautious or aware of what the data contains. And really, regardless of, to be honest, regardless of where your data comes from, you need to know data management from a risk and compliance perspective. And the most important consideration here in 2021 is a piece of legislation called the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, which has been in effect now since 2018. And I'm sure most people in this room have at least heard of GDPR in some form or another. But either way, no presentation on effective data sourcing could really ignore it. So for those of you who are perhaps less familiar with GDPR, GDPR is an EU-wide legislation, which in a nutshell protects people's personal data. So what do we mean by personally identifiable information? So the definition included in the legislation is given on the slide: any information that relates to an identified or identifiable individual. And it goes on to elaborate on this, but we have some examples on the slide, some of them more obvious than others, and some of them perhaps not so obvious, of personally identifiable information. So one of them would be GPS data, obviously. Job application data contains a lot of sensitive data points, personal photographs, even photographs that are publicly available on like Facebook profiles or social media profile pictures would be considered personal data under GDPR. And then other things like names and addresses, telephone numbers, and any personal information that has been anonymized, that is, you've removed or you've made efforts to attempt to remove any links to the person. Anonymized data is actually still considered personal data if it initially began as personal data under GDPR. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So earlier I said GDPR is EU legislation, which is true, but more than that, it affects all organizations which conduct business with or collect data for citizens of not just the EU, but the entire European Economic Area, as well as Switzerland, which has its own equivalent legislation, and the UK via the Data Protection Act of 2018, which we tend to call GDPR UK, which incorporates GDPR and includes the protections offered by the Act, as well as the powers to impose fines. Now the fines, which are available in the GDPR, are probably the most well-known and headline-grabbing aspects of the legislation. And GDPR UK has the power to impose fines of up to £17.5 million, or 4% of turnover for the organization, whichever is higher. And these fines are not just hypothetical. In the years since the legislation came into effect, a number of high-profile fines have been issued. The biggest one was in 2019 to Google, and Google was fined €50 million. So yeah. Now, having said all of that, obviously, because most talks about GDPR and every training I've been to on GDPR actually really focus on the punitive aspect of it and see it as an obstacle, which it kind of is. It is worth noting that the goal of GDPR is at least to rein in the ability of companies to abuse personal data and really to empower the owners of that data, which is all of us, to have rights over the data that companies hold on us and the data that you hold on other people, to delete any personal data that's been collected about you, and then also to correct anything that needs updating. So that's just another perspective on that as well. Yeah, that's it. I think we've got a poll now, another poll. If that could be launched, please. Great. Yeah, so another poll. So poor data quality this time. You can see the polls are sort of linked to what's coming afterwards. So poor data quality costs. So a survey of US companies predicted poor data quality negatively impacts the US economy to the tune of how much in US dollars? So pop in your answers, please. Just guess, if you don't know, obviously. Yeah. And most people got the, well, 46% of people got the right answer. That is, yeah, $3 trillion is the correct answer. 30 trillion would be more than the GDP of the US. I believe that this is actually including the idea that, you know, it negatively impacts the US economy because bad decisions are made. I think it's probably also includes like opportunities that were missed through bad data. So it's a staggeringly large number anyway, regardless of how you see it. Great, can we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, and this is the final slide for me, I think. So we're just gonna move on to integrating your data. So assuming that you've already sourced some data or you're planning on sourcing your data, it's another aspect to consider really when you're sourcing data is how it's going to be integrated. So when it comes to data management and data processing, especially from a data engineering perspective, so like my perspective, I guess, it's useful to distinguish between what you call structured and unstructured data. And how you process and integrate the data depends really on whether you're starting with structured data or you're starting with unstructured data. So just for structured data, so structured data is simply data that can be easily read by computer software. So relatively easily onboarded into databases, integrated with other data, perhaps from other sources, and it's quite painless to do so. So examples of raw structured data include spreadsheets, XML files, JSON files, log files from services. And from the perspective of a data analyst or a data scientist, structured format, raw data in this structured format is very malleable and easy to work with compared to unstructured data. Unfortunately, perhaps unfortunately, unstructured data is much more widely available than structured data. In fact, by some estimates, 80 to 90% of all data generated today can be considered unstructured. And unstructured data is quite simply data that is primarily or exclusively consumed by us, by people. And it includes text, books, photographs, image files, video, audio, and most common document formats, including PDF, which I've included because I work with PDF a lot. And when it comes to generating insights from your data or building data products, when the data comes in an unstructured format, much of the role of someone who manages the sourcing of this unstructured data or manages the data in general is to add structure to the unstructured data. In other words, to turn unstructured data into structured data that can be easily integrated with other data from other sources. And then you can, once it's in a structured format, you can then do clever things like generate insights and build data products with the data. So in the case of raw text data, the transformation might involve what we call natural language processing, which is a field within computer science and linguistics, which attempts to programmatically understand human languages, generally by applying statistical or machine learning algorithms. In fact, advances in machine learning and AI are making it much easier to work with unstructured data, but a lot of challenges still remain. And there's a presentation on Thursday, I believe, on how machine learning and AI can help you deal with some of this data. Another aspect of integrating your data, which also applies to raw structured data, as well as unstructured data, is data modeling, which I'll hand over to Nikolai now to discuss.
Thanks, Rio. Can we have the next slide, please? Great. So yes, as Rio was saying, picking up on the on the question of integrating your data and how you do this, particularly once you arrived at a structured data set, your journey unfortunately is not necessarily at an end at this point in time. Often the task of obtaining raw data is actually the easy part of your data source, your data collection project. What comes in is really to turn this into a useful model that you can use to drive your output generation, whether that is an analytical output, whether this relates to like running a model of some description, whatever it is. And really what this comes down to is the fact that the data can present itself, the data that you source in its raw form can present itself in so many different varieties that it is hard to derive at an unambiguous or even just indicative response answer to your questions. So to give you an example, we ran a project within our organization within J.P. Morgan to find out what data we were actually sending out to our clients. You'd be surprised to know that we didn't necessarily know this a long time ago. We're still figuring this out. But we started this journey, as I indicated earlier, some fairly low-tech means. We sent a questionnaire, like an Excel template, to a lot of our salespeople, and asked them to fill it in. And we thought these were fairly straightforward questions that would give us straightforward answers to what's actually being sent out. Including such things as describing the asset class, that a certain data asset would relate to. What we then quickly found out, though, is that there's several hundred ways of expressing the same sentiment or the same kind of answer, in such a questionnaire. Specifically, when it came to it, for example, we realized there's 40, 50 different ways of spelling the word equities in a way that still makes sense to most humans, but not necessarily, helps us bring this into a framework that allows us to look at it through an analytical lens. So where I'm getting to is this: in order to make the responses or the raw data that we received more usable, we had to constrain the type of response or the type of answers we would be getting to our questions by imposing some kind of taxonomy on this. So we had to prescribe the response people were getting. We had to say, okay, you can choose from a pick list of values, for example, to answer the question what asset class a particular data set belongs to. Or we would have to say, okay, if you give us a date or a timeline, here is a format that you have to respond us to. Or we have to indicate, whether something is a binary outcome and you give us a true or false or yes or no kind of flag. And that really enabled us to take the results that we were gathering and turn it into analytical output that we could take forward and present to our management, which was very well received. But the key lesson for everybody, on this call really is that you need to actually have a think about this and go through that process. So you have to go and come up with a logical data model. And before you start switching off, because that sounds scary, it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be as simple as the table, that you see, for example, on the slide that we have, where you really just outline, specifically, what data points you're collecting, how they're represented in the typology, and in the end, what values, how you want the values to be represented. The key point to consider when you go through this is there is a trade-off between the between the flexibility of getting a wide variety of results versus the ease of interpretation, right? And this is where you got to be judicious in the way you choose the use of taxonomies or other prescriptive models that constrain the way people can answer questions that you're asking them, or how you normalize the raw data that you might have sourced in other means. So this does not only apply to your own in-house sourced surveys or questionnaires that you run, but any form of data set that you source, you will want to take a look at first and understand whether what you get there is fit for the purpose that you're looking at, right? So even if it's a clean and well presented data set, a well structured data set that you've sourced from an open source, for example, that is very useful for you, you may not want to get every data point from this in the form that it's presented, but rather normalize it into the shape that you want for your particular analysis, for your particular output model that you're looking to generate. And I think this takes us to our third polling question, which Ria, as I said before, I can't see, so I had the reins back to you on that one.
Yep, sure. Can we have the poll? Thank you. Yeah. So this is just a fun one. In April 2021, the records of how many Facebook users were compromised after they had been scraped and published on a hacking forum. So 533,000, 5.3 million, 53 million, or 533 million. All vote now. Okay, I believe, Nicola, I believe the correct answer was D, 533 million. Yep, so yeah, the 18% of people got it correct. Yeah, cool, all right, just a bit of fun.
All right, can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So what we wanted to do really is cap off, this presentation by pointing out that we think it is helpful to think of data collection as a journey, and that's not just in terms of conceiving, designing, and executing a particular program, but also in the way that you evolve your collection of data and its use over time. And this comes back to some of the points that we've mentioned, in this presentation. It's just useful to go over these together again, right? I think the first point to bear in mind is start small. Don't worry about it. Spreadsheets and questionnaires are perfectly suitable, for many data collection programs. You don't need to be particularly, technologically evolved or expensive, for many use cases. Right? Even modest results can generate insights and value, and not least when you're looking into data collection, into your own data collection, that can help you make better decisions for your organization, work out where you want to focus your resources, or just have a discussion about what you actually want to do. Right? It starts small. You don't need to aim for the moon straight away. That comes later. And that when I say that comes later, right? That's what we kind of say when we say, okay, scale up when the time is right. Scaling up data collection is a natural development, with a number of observations and data points, grows beyond what is practically manageable, within common low-cost tools, whether it's Excel or something like that, right? And I guess the point to make here is that also, if the scale of your data collection becomes so large that investment into specialized tools is necessary to continue, then you probably are at a point where the value proposition of the program will likely be concrete enough for you to allow consideration for that kind of investment. So run as far, walk as far as you can, and then start thinking about running, I guess is what we're saying. Final point really in this context is to say, make sure that you always reassess and evolve as you move along. Right? Not every data collection program needs to evolve from collecting stuff in Excel to a relational database, putting it all on a Kafka bus, and then a Hadoop cluster or something along those lines before it then feeds into an AI or machine learning analytical program. That's the end state for some organizations, but that's by no means a prescribed path that you have to follow or even envisage. That's not how it all has to end. Even basic data gathered systematically can be very powerful and serve as a foundation for change and improvement, in many, many different ways. So just bear that in mind, because you will, as you learn to walk, as you learn to understand how you collect data, how you organize it, how you integrate it, and then use it for output, you will get better at asking the right kind of questions to move that on. Right? And that's, I think, a key, message that we wanted to get across. Is just go with that. Move along, and grow as you develop, your own abilities in this space. And I think before we go to open it up for questions, I think you collected a couple of resources for people to look at. Maybe if you just wanted to say a few words to that, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah. Can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah. So these are just, I believe the slides will be shared. So these are just some resources that will help, I guess, could help someone if they were starting on a data sourcing journey. Obviously, we've included Microsoft Excel as one of these, but other things like I personally would recommend Apache Airflow if anyone wanted to build any workflows end to end, because it's a very nice environment to work in for data scientists as well to use. And then on the right-hand side, you have some links to open data repositories, which I think will be quite useful to anyone who is interested in exploring that. That's it from me.
Thank you, Rio, Nikolai. So we're now, we'll open the floor to some questions. So I see we actually have a couple of these coming up in the chat. So on your latest point, Rio, about open data sources, obviously there's a lot of data in there, and you mentioned that usually there's a lot you can get out of this data when you're well versed into it or an expert, but looking into open data from another angle and perhaps from a more less expert perspective, how can one tell whether a source in an open data environment is credible and legit?
Cool. Yeah, great question. So I guess putting my global data hat on. So I work in the global data department in Bloomberg, which our product is data. And one really important attribute for every data point that we would publish to clients is provenance. And so data provenance is essentially just the chain of transmission. So where did the data originally come from? Who's touched it, and so on? Because quite often you would get data from intermediate parties that would have originally been disclosed by a specific company or by a specific organization, in our case. So I would really suggest looking at where the data is coming from. In usually open data sets, they will strongly, they would advertise where they come from. Census data, you download it from the Gov UK website for the UK, or you would get open data sets directly from university websites. I would probably guard against using like blog spots that have just like, anyone can share on. But yeah, just if you know it's from a credible source, particularly the original source of the data, then you're probably reasonably well set to go. Also, just if you use the links that are on these slides, then that will probably give you some good resources as well.
Thank you for the tip. And I guess question for you, Nikolai, you mentioned that as you look into data sourcing, data modeling, it's important to start small and also see how one can potentially evolve along the way. For someone who is designing its data processing system, for instance, how can this person make sure that data collection is really embedded throughout this data design process? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
That's that also is a very good question. I think one of the points to bear in mind here, which we didn't mention, it should have, I guess, is if you are looking to embed data collection, in your core processes, and in order to make sure this is not a one-off exercise that you overlay, and irritate people by ringing them up, is it needs to be, this goes back to what I was trying to highlight early on. It goes back to the purpose of the exercise, and you need buy-in for this. And I think this is absolutely crucial if you're looking into sourcing data out of your own organization, whether it's operationally through service or whatever it may be. The use case and the purpose of the exercise needs to be well understood by those that are going to be part of that collection exercise, whether that is through the change of existing procedures or investment in infrastructure, or the ask for participation, in data collection exercises, on a manual basis, whatever it is. You will not get very far if you can't convey what the point of the exercise is. I mean, it mustn't be, and I'm going to be very regimental about this. I don't think it is helpful for that to be a black box. If your pitch is, we're going to collect data and give it to the smart guys upstairs who are going to cook up, some kind of a recommendation, you will not get a useful response. If the message is, if we integrate the collection of call stats or operational, response rates or contact mappings, as part of our day-to-day interaction with our clients, our donors, our co-workers or whatever, in order to facilitate that process, of making it work better. And if you can explain that, then you'll have a much better chance of, getting organizational buy-in in getting forward. So whatever you do, articulate your use case, articulate the point of the exercise, and syndicate it well. So whatever the technical solution may look like, if you don't have buy-in from the organization, it'll always be on the outside. It mustn't be perceived as something that's alien to the core of what you're looking to do. Otherwise, you won't have success.
And speaking of goals, some organizations have been obviously collecting data for years. What if a nonprofit organization has lost track of the goals that inform the sourcing because there's change in management or in the teams? From both your perspective, what would be the best way to overcome this barrier from what you know?
So I guess, so if I understand the question correctly, right, then what you're saying is data collection has been going on, but the point of it has been lost in the midst of time because you've had change of personnel, change of management or sponsors, and it's gone away. I think you have two dangers here, right? One is that you switch off your data collection and lose the capability. The other is that you continue doing your data collection and keep alienating people because they don't know what's going on or why you're bothering with it. And I would say that in the majority of cases, you will probably find that the second risk is the greater. If you collect data for the sake of it, you're creating noise, you're creating admin, you're creating volume in the infrastructure, you're creating processes and creating cost. If you don't know what you're doing, this sounds harsh, stop doing it and have to think about why you would want to do this. I'm not saying switch it all off straight away, but if I had to make a decision between we continue doing what we've always done, but we don't know what it's for or how we're going to use it, and the question of or just turn it off and avoid the overhead, then I probably are on the side of saying let's not bother until we figure out what we want to do. If you don't have an intuitive understanding of the data you're collecting, at the moment, then you probably need to spend some time thinking about why you're doing this. Else, there's no point. Ria, I don't know how you feel about this.
I agree completely. I think going back to the blackboard or the drawing board for what you're trying to collect data for at that point is definitely what you should be doing. And yeah, maybe obviously just switching off the data collection channel so that you're not generating work for someone who has to clean, organize, and deal with this data that you're not doing anything useful with.
Thank you. And we have on another question on basically how can one scale if their manual process takes a long time? Could you perhaps share some advice? Obviously, on the long term, if it takes you a lot of time to sort of manually process the data, then it becomes perhaps hard to use it later down the line because it's not the actual use case is no longer here. So can you perhaps elaborate a bit more on that?
I can speak to that a little bit. I think it's quite a broad question, but I think I can narrow it. I can just sort of focus on an aspect of it. So certainly when it comes to scaling up data collection, there are a lot of challenges, but also a lot of opportunities. So within global data, for example, in Bloomberg, we have been, we collect data all the time. And one of the difficulties is how quickly we can source data that has a time limit on it. So for example, within finance, the price of securities yesterday's price isn't relevant tomorrow, or isn't relevant today, rather. So you really want everything to be timely. So it's all about making sure that you're actually getting the data in when people need it. And that's obviously an ongoing challenge, but there are ways that you can help yourself. So we find that micro-tasking and crowdsourcing and all of these things that were probably not as easy to do 5 or 10 years ago really help with data procurement and data collection. Also, just automating what you can. So rather than having someone manually opening files and collecting files from websites, try automating it with web crawlers. Just be smart about it. And yeah, I don't know. It's quite a broad question, but there are so many different possible ways that you could improve your scaling up. But I think using the crowd and using groups of people to actually do it on a microtasking basis, and then also being smart and using technology are probably the most common solutions.
Nikolai, anything else to add from your perspective?
Well, no. I think I would, I at the danger of sounding like we're agreeing too much. I mean, I'm entirely with Rio on this one. I think one thing to emphasize or maybe illustrate by example is, a lot of data collection, particularly if it's happening in-house, starts off with some form of manual aggregation, in something like Excel or another, like in a spreadsheet solution that is readily available and understood. And when you run into the buffers of that, when you find that opening a file takes 7 minutes, and every time you touch the recalc key, everything falls over, which is a place where I've been in some of the projects we've done. Then yes, it is definitely time to look into like some of the more specialized tooling that you can get at no great expense. Whether it is like a workflow or data wrangling tool, something like Alteryx or Trifactors, things like that. They actually allow you to focus on workflows and work steps that you otherwise would take hours or days to execute manually or on a repetitive basis, and reduce them with a minimum upfront time investment to something that can be achieved in a couple of minutes or seconds even. So I think you'll probably find you'll naturally find you're going to go to the barriers of what you can do with the tooling that you have. And once that becomes such that whoever does it starts moaning about the fact that it is unwieldy or takes too long, then it's time to look for the next level up.
And on this, you mentioned several times machine learning and natural language processing, and that these tools are being increasingly used to source data. In your mind, how can a nonprofit organization can balance the use of AI and what you can call sort of human checks and balances? Really opening the floor to both of you, whoever wants to start.
Yeah, I'm happy to start on that one. So yeah, I think one of the interesting things that's happened in recent years is we have more easily accessed solutions that can do this for us. So when I'm talking about machine learning that can support you, there are platforms out there. They're like the big companies like Microsoft and Google and so on will make it easier for you to use machine learning, and you can plug these into workflows. For example, if they're hosted on cloud platforms like AWS or anything like that, where you could actually have apps on S3 or any I don't want to advertise specific platforms, but any platforms that allow you to like have code that's running, you could then use machine learning to do things like, for example, if you were sourcing, and this is very much from my own world, but PDF documents, you could use machine learning algorithms to extract text or to read the images in the documents and then pass them on to the next step within a pipeline as structured data that can then be integrated into a database. For nonprofits, I think working with these cloud companies, I've seen within this actually seminar, some interesting use cases where companies and nonprofits have worked with cloud companies to do very clever things using at least statistical learning. I'm not sure about machine learning or natural language processing, but I'm sure the options are available. And really that just helps you to get the best out of the unstructured data that you're dealing with. Yeah. That's just my thoughts.
Yeah, I think one element, that I'd like to highlight in this context is you don't always need to rush towards the largest technology or the most advanced technology base you can find. Right? I mean, I think we are quite eloquently talking a little bit about some of the options that you have if you're looking to get into that space and avail yourself of capabilities that might get you where you want to be with this. But in all honesty, you don't always have to go and aim for a machine learning solution if a simple regression might do the trick. I think it's a little bit of a fallacy sometimes, in discourse that when people talk about data collection and analytical use of data, they draw a straight line to the use of AI and machine learning specifically, which, yes, there's a line, but we don't all have to travel on this line straight away in all use cases, particularly if you're talking about data universes that are humanly overseeable in number, right? That you can manage, in some of the frameworks that you're aware of. You need a lot of data to get into a space where using machine learning effectively really becomes an option. So unless you're talking about those dimensions, you probably don't need to stress too much about it.
Definitely. And I think this is also a great segue to actually the next session that will be happening this afternoon on data organization and storage. So if you haven't signed up yet, it's still time to do so on our website. And so finally, to close the session, Rio, Nikolai, could you perhaps share with us one thing you would like to leave the audience with? Any word of wisdom?
Yeah, I can start on that. Yeah, I think when it comes to sourcing your data, maybe be pragmatic. So I did stress on the slide where I was talking about commercially versus non-commercial sources that you might wish to choose to pay for the data. And that is actually sometimes the cheapest approach, but also explore other approaches. And I think, yeah, whatever is the sort of pragmatic option for the problem you face, don't be afraid to use it, because sometimes you can get caught up in thinking that you have to have this kind of solution, but really just explore what options you have and really what's the best solution for the problem you have, and also the one that has the best ROI, the best sort of return on investment.
I think what I would like to throw out there, the danger of alienating large parts of the audience is, just because it's data, don't just leave it to the techies. It's a topic that everybody who's invested in an organization should feel comfortable approaching and discussing. We've mentioned it as part of this presentation. All data use is contextual. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not neutral. Even if you're not technical, if you can't code or are slightly put off by statistical analysis, that does not mean you can't contribute meaningfully to the discussion around the use of data and how to make it better. So I would encourage everybody to engage with the subject and not treat it as something that only the chosen few can engage in.
Well, thank you for this advice and this very valuable presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We hope that you will be able to join us on our next sessions today and tomorrow. And thank you again, Rio, Nikolai, for a great presentation.